All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our office hours webinar for BrainHQ today. We're so glad that you could be joining us. My name is Stephanie and I'll be one of your hosts for today's webinar. Now, our goal for the office hours webinar series, if maybe you're new here, is designed to show up a specific feature within BrainHQ. And then after the presentation, we'll go ahead and open the floor and answer any questions that you might have about those features. So today's presentation, we'll be going over the science behind the exercises, the secret sauce, what is getting the gears turning behind the scenes. So our main presenter today is going to be Dr. Henry Manka, and Henry is going to talk about the core scientific principles behind BrainHQ and how they work together to build a more resilient brain. After that, we will go ahead and pivot to taking questions from the audience. So if at any point during the presentation today you have a question, go ahead and select the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel, and a little window should pop up where you can type in your questions. Now, there are a lot more of you in the audience than there are me and Henry, so we aren't going to be able to answer every question today. But if you have a really, really burning question that you need answered, we would encourage you to go to our support site, support.brainhq.com, to look for the answer to your question. Or you can also email us at support@brainhq.com. That'll either reach me or one of our other customer delight specialists. Now, the other thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel sometime next week. If you'd like to be notified when this video goes live, you can go to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe there in order to receive a notification. All right, so a little brief primer about me. Hi, once again, I'm Stephanie. I've been working with Posit Science since 2014 in the Customer Delight department here. Before that, I was a science communicator and docent at a science museum here in San Francisco. Even though I wear a few more hats now than I did when I first started at Posit Science 9 years ago now, my gosh, I'm still answering questions from users like you all pretty much every day. Now, my co-host today is also a returning webinar host here, Dr. Henry Manka. Now, Henry earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California, San Francisco, and that's where he studied brain plasticity with our co-founder, Dr. Michael Merzenich. He's been running the show here as our CEO of Posit Science since 2011. All right, so hi, Henry, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Stephanie. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Of course, anytime. So Henry, you are free to take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, so we're going to dive in, as Stephanie said, and talk about the science behind these BrainHQ exercises. And let me get my screen sharing going here. So thanks to everyone for coming today. As Stephanie mentioned, we're in our office hours seminar or meeting here, and we're really going to talk about, hey, what is the science behind these exercises, which is another way of saying, hey, why do they work the way they work? Like, what are they trying to do? How are they different from just other kind of things you might do with your brain on an everyday basis? Hey, I think it's going to be interesting and exciting because it's going to help you get more out of the BrainHQ exercises. And I think the science of how the brain can change is a pretty fun and interesting one. So let's dive right in. And, the first thing that, of course, I have to say is that if we're going to talk about the science behind BrainHQ exercises, we're going to talk about brain plasticity, which is, of course, the idea that the brain can change and rewire itself. And it's important to say that, hey, scientists' understanding of how the brain works has undergone just this enormous change itself over the years. If you were to rewind the clock to, let's say, 1970, and you were to ask any brain scientist, how does the brain work? Every one of them would have said exactly the same thing, which is, hey, the brain's kind of like a computer chip inside your head, right? It has wires, it conducts electricity, it processes information. Computer chips were new and exciting in 1970 or so, and so everyone thought, well, that's what the brain is, like a computer chip. But that led to some pretty wrong ideas about brains and brain health, because, as we all know, computers wear out over time and they can't be fixed. And that generally led people to think that, well, if the brain's like a chip, the brain probably wears out over time. And if the brain gets a little damaged and some of those wires get broken, well, nothing to be done about it. It can't be fixed. And the most important thing I want to say about our view about brain health is that nobody believes that anymore. Every scientist operating these days, 2023, knows that the brain is plastic. It's capable of changing and rewiring itself, changing its structure, its function, and even its chemistry. And that idea is called brain plasticity. We used to think the brain was hardwired, and now we think it's soft-wired, that it changes itself as you learn and as you experience the world, and in fact, as you train your brain. And that's just an enormous breakthrough in our understanding. But if we understand that the brain can be changed, well, let's figure out how to do something useful with it. So let's take a little bit more look at this. Where did this idea come from that the brain can be changed? Well, there have been, hundreds and even thousands of experiments directly demonstrating this kind of brain training change, this kind of brain plasticity change in all kinds of animals and in humans. But let me talk to you about rats in particular, because, rats are a very wonderful little group of animals to work with to start to think about brain health. And so what I want to show you here is 3 different types of rats. Now, this first rat here has a high-performing brain. In this case, the rat is pretty young and it's very sharp. And if we look at that rat's brain, what we see is illustrated in this kind of colorful mix of shapes over here. And what this represents is we're looking down on the rat's brain, and in particular, we're looking at a part of the rat's brain that has to do with hearing. And what each of these little shapes shows us is how quick and accurate is that part of the rat's brain. And blue means it's very fast and accurate. It responds exactly to what the rat hears, very precisely and very quickly. And red means that it's kind of noisy and fuzzy. Now, if we look at this brain of this high-performing rat, we see, hey, most of this is blue, a little bit of green, and just a tiny bit of red. And that means the whole brain here is just tuned up for fast, accurate performance. When the rat hears something in the outside world, that information is translated quickly and accurately into brain activity, so the rat knows what's going on. Maybe it hears that a cat is coming and it can do something about it. But let's look at this next rat. Now, this next rat has a low-performing brain. Maybe they've gotten old and they're not doing so well. Maybe they've had some brain damage, as can happen to rats as well as it can happen to humans. What happens when we look at that map of the brain? Well, we see that much more of it is now red and orange. And that means these are regions of the brain that are noisy. They're kind of slow to respond. They're kind of murky. They don't tell the rat exactly what is going on in the outside of the world. And that means when that cat is about to pounce and maybe gives out a little squeak, the rat's brain doesn't notice it quite as well or as accurately. And of course, that can lead to troubles if you're a rat. Now, this last rat has gone through a rat brain training program that was developed in the lab of Dr. Michael Merznick, the founder of Posit Science and my PhD advisor. And you can tell that they've been through a rat brain training program because, look, they're wearing this little college diploma hat on their head, aren't they? Now, if a rat that was a low-performing rat goes through a rat brain training program, well, look at that beautiful brain that shows up. Every part of this brain is now colored blue or green, meaning the rat is processing information quickly and accurately. And in fact, just as quickly and accurately as a young rat does, or in some cases, even better. So these kinds of experiments and a lot more experiments like them really showed us that, hey, it was possible to take a brain and rewire it to making a high-performing brain, at least in rats. So what we did at Posit Science when we built BrainHQ is we took this basic science of brain plasticity and we turned it into something that, well, people could use, like you and me and Stephanie. And what we did is we took the core ideas from all those rat experiments and we said, well, look, what is it that drives brain change? Well, it turns out that working on exercises that challenge speed, that train the accuracy of information processing, working on exercises that are adaptive. So they get harder as you get better and they get easier if you're not having such a good day. Building exercises that are explicitly designed to generalize so that you're not just getting better at what you practice at in the exercise, but that change in your brain actually leads to real-world changes as well. And building exercises that engage important systems in the brain like attention and reward and novelty detection. When we build these kinds of exercises for rats that engage these 5 factors, well, we see the rat's brain get healthier, exactly as we just talked about. And so when we started to build the BrainHQ exercises, we built exercises that engage these 5 principles and made them for people, as you've seen in BrainHQ. And in fact, I'm going to demo 2 exercises in just a minute here, and we'll talk about how each of these exercises targets speed and accuracy and adaptive performance and generalization and engagement so that they work to build a healthier brain for you and to lead to a sharper brain and sharper real-world performance in everyday life. And in fact, we know that they work because we've taken them out, and we and our scientific collaborators from all over the world have run BrainHQ exercises through dozens and dozens and dozens of scientific studies. In fact, there are now more than 200 scientific publications that use BrainHQ exercises in all kinds of people. And what we see in those studies is, well, BrainHQ exercises rewire the brain, just like they do in those rats. It happens in us too. We see faster neural timing and stronger brain activation and even better brain connectivity in people after doing these exercises. Now, that's great if you're a neuroscientist like me, but what most people care about, of course, is that in these studies over and over again, we see that they help people think faster and focus better and remember more by improving speed and attention and memory. And then in study after study, we see that sharper cognitive function leads to better real world life, right? Helps people be happier with a healthy brain and healthier, helps people be sharper at work and at life, even safer. As a study that just came out earlier this year showing that people who did BrainHQ exercises who were at high risk of falls actually reduced their risk of having a fall by 30%, and even helps brains be more resilient. So changing the brain in the way that we saw in that rat, changing the brain in that way in people leads to better, healthier brains. So how does it actually do that? Well, here, let's dive into an exercise. And I'm going to start off with Hawkeye. And let me swap my screen share here. There we go. So you're now seeing my BrainHQ screen in this demo account. And of course, if you're using BrainHQ, you probably quite commonly use the personal trainer where BrainHQ picks out the exercises for you. I'm going to actually just pick out one or two specific exercises to demo. So I'm going to click on the Explore All Exercises button here, which lets me pick out an individual exercise. And we're going to have a look at Hawkeye, which is a very classic brain speed training exercise. So let me click on Hawkeye and let's go to the exercise. Now, this is a demo account. On this demo account, I haven't done any training yet, so you don't see any medals up here. You don't see any progress right here. It's just a clean slate for us to show things on. And I'm going to show the very first level of Hawkeye by clicking here on this empty square. So when I do that, and I'm going to turn off the instructions because I can give the instructions here in this webinar today. We're going to see Hawkeye, and probably many people on this webinar today have done the Hawkeye exercise. You know, when I click start, a whole bunch of birds are going to appear in my peripheral vision, right? Not where I'm looking in the center, but out in the periphery here. And one bird's going to be different. You can see they have a black tail and sort of a black head. And then all these distractor birds will be competing for my attention. So I'm going to click start and let's give it a try. There are the birds, and then they go away. Now, that might have been a little bit fast. Sometimes on a webinar here, it drops a few frames. You don't see it all, but if you've done Hawkeye, you know you see it on your screen. And I saw that target bird over here at what I'll call, let's say, about the 8 o'clock position. So I'm going to click on it. I got it right, and I heard a little beep. Now, let's pause for a moment. What happened as I did that exercise in my brain? Well, first of all, my brain was required to be fast. I couldn't just sit around and look at the birds all day. And in fact, if the birds were up there for a long time, the exercise would be very easy. Any of us can find that bird when we have all day to look at it. So we're already asking my brain to be fast. Next, I have to be accurate. I have to notice where that bird is, and I can't click anywhere kind of on the left side of my screen. I have to click pretty precisely where that bird was. So I'm training accuracy as well. Next of all, these exercises are adaptive. Now, if you saw me do a few more, or if you've done a Hawkeye yourself, you know that as I get it right, it gets faster, actually. And hey, if I get a few wrong, it slows down. And in fact, what that means is it's always pushing me to be my best. It's never giving me ones that are too hard for me to do a long time in a row, but it's also not going to give me ones that are so easy that I get them all right. We have to challenge the brain in order to rewire it. Next, we'll talk about generalization in a moment. I'll come back to that, but let me also say that the final thing that happens as I'm doing this is it gauges my attention, right? I have to pay attention to do these exercises. You know, if the dog barks or the UPS person comes to the door and I have to look away and not pay attention, I'm not going to be able to get it right. Well, attention is very interesting because when you're paying attention, your brain releases a neurochemical called acetylcholine. And what that does is it tells the brain, hey, something important is going on here. You need to get ready to rewire yourself because you're doing something that you care about. So by forcing a situation where the brain pays attention, we allow the brain to rewire itself. The next thing that happens, of course, is I'm rewarded. When I get it right, I hear that ding and there's a little animation on the screen. And it seems like a small thing, but that gives your brain feedback that you've done this right. And when you give the brain that feedback, your brain actually pumps dopamine. Now, you might have heard of dopamine. Sometimes people call it the pleasure chemical, right? That's what happens when we eat chocolate or something, right? It feels really good, and so we want to eat some more chocolate. And that's true, but dopamine has a broader role in the brain. When your brain releases some dopamine, it tells your brain, hey, whatever you just did, that was good. Rewire yourself to do more things like that. And so when we get one right in BrainHQ, we get that little sound, that little animation, it pumps some dopamine. That also helps our brain rewire itself so that we're generating a faster, sharper brain. So those things are all happening at the same time. Let's keep going and do a few more together. I'll just want to show that category of adaptivity. So there's our bird down here around 5 o'clock. I'll get it right. And as I do so, you see those arrows in the top start to fill in. And when I get 2 of them right in a row, that whole bubble moves up. And that means that Hawkeye has gotten a little bit faster. And you might be able to even see this as I do it. As I'm getting them right, the birds are on the screen for a faster and faster period of time. And that's challenging my brain. The exercise is getting harder. Now, I want to emphasize that while the birds are on the screen for a shorter period of time, I don't have to click fast. I'm not even allowed to click until the birds go away. And once they've gone away, I can take all the time I like to click. So we're not trying to make you be faster at clicking on the keyboard. We're trying to make your brain get faster at noticing where that bird is. And of course, if I miss one, no problem. It just gives me a little thunk, shows me where the bird was, and it slows down. So in that sense, it's adaptive. And the way the scientists on the team have designed these exercises is you're going to get about 80% of these right, which means for every 5 trials you do in BrainHQ, you probably get 4 of them right. And that's exactly the right level to keep rewiring your brain. So we talked about speed, we talked about accuracy, we talked a little bit about adaptivity, and we talked a little bit about engagement. I now want to talk about generalization. What's that 5th ingredient that makes the BrainHQ exercises work? Well, to look at that, we're going to have to look at another level in Hawkeye. So we did the first one briefly. Let's take a quick look at the second level in Hawkeye. Now, when we see this level, first of all, we see the same birds we've seen before, right? Here's our target bird, black head, black tail. Here's our distractor birds, but now they're further out in our peripheral vision. So we trained with them near to the center of our vision, and now we're training them in the far part of our peripheral vision. And that's because we want the brain to get faster and more accurate across your entire field of view, right? So we're going to train all parts of it. And then what happens if we keep going in BrainHQ? Well, let's go to a next level. Let's try this one. Now, when we get to this level, here the birds are close to the center of vision again, but they're a little more complicated now. Here's our target bird. They've got striped wings here and a striped tail. Here's our distractor birds, but they're pretty similar. The brain now has to work harder to tell which one is which. And also there's now a background here. There's this kind of gray sort of smoky mountain background. And that means our brain has to work harder to have these birds pop out against the background. Well, we're challenging the brain in new ways here. And so why are we doing that? Do we just want you to become a better bird watcher? And the answer is no. Bird watching is a wonderful hobby. It's probably good for the brain. If you're a bird watcher, fantastic. You should enjoy that. It's good for you. But we're not trying to make brains better bird watchers here. We're trying to make brains that when you're out in the world, quickly and accurately notice things all across your visual field of view. Imagine you're out driving in the neighborhood, right? And you're driving along, and a ball rolls into the street. You know, if your brain, like that rat we talked about, is a little slow, a little sluggish, not processing information quickly and accurately, you might not notice that ball roll in as you're driving. And of course, that's risky because if a ball rolls in, probably a kid's going to come chase after that ball in just a minute. But if your brain is operating quickly and accurately, so you're noticing things all across your visual field quickly and accurately, well, you have a much better chance of noticing that ball in your peripheral vision. It's not going to be like it came out of nowhere, because you're going to see it and you're going to do what, of course, you know you should do, which is slow down or even stop the car to stay safe. And that's what these exercises are trying to do by training speed, accuracy in an adaptive way with stimuli like these birds that generalize across all parts of your visual or your sensory fields, and doing so in such a way that engages your attention and your reward systems. We're rewiring the brain, just like was shown in that rats, and we're going to give people better brains that perform better in real world situations. So that's one exercise. Let me take a look at another exercise just to show how we take those principles and we apply them to an entirely different situation. Let's swap over now to the exercise called fine tuning. So fine tuning is also a speed exercise that's found here. Let me click on this. And let's do this third level, which I happen to like. But before I start, I want to do a little demo that we can actually all participate in, even though we're just doing a webinar today. And we're going to talk briefly about why is speed and accuracy important for speech. So what I want you to do is I want you to take your thumb and your index finger, and I want you to stick your throat out a little bit. And I want you to put your thumb and your index finger right on your voice box here. Don't squeeze tight. I'm not trying to hurt yourself, but just so you can feel it. And now I want everyone to make this sound. I want you to make the sound ba, kind of like a bottle. Ba, ba, ba. Is everyone doing that with me? Now, when you make that sound, ba, you can feel that your lips open right at the same time that your voice box starts to vibrate. Ba, ba. Now I want you to make a different sound. I want you to make the sound pa, like my papa is coming back home tonight. We'll put our fingers on our voice box here again and say papa, pa, pa. Now, as you do that, you might be able to detect that your lips open just a little bit before your voice box starts to vibrate. Pa, pa. There's actually a very short gap there. And that gap is actually what makes the difference between a ba and a pa. The ba doesn't have a gap. The pa does have a gap. Now that gap is very short, just tiny fractions of a second. So again, if a brain is working kind of slowly and noisily, it's not going to notice that gap. And what that is going to mean is that speech is going to sound muffled. Words are going to get mixed up. And in fact, as a result, they're not going to get stored in memory very well. If you're out at a restaurant and it's kind of noisy in the background, you're not processing that speech sound very well. It's going to be harder to pay attention to what your friends are talking about and harder to remember it. But we can make that better, just like happened with the rat. And here's how we go about that. That's what fine tuning is designed to do. So let's click on this one. And let's do a little bit of fine tuning together. Now, in this level of fine tuning, we're going to be listening for the differences between the do sound and the to sound. And it's not exactly the same as a ba and a pa, but the idea is very similar, as I think you can see. So let's listen to a few of them.
Toe.
Okay. Toe.
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 Now, you might have heard already that toe sounded a little bit faster than the last one did.
Toe. Toe.
It's giving me a lot of toes here, but I promise it's going to change.
Toe. Do.
There's a do. So what's happening in this version of the exercise? Well, let's talk about all of those things again. Speed, first of all. Well, when we make these do and to sounds, when they start off, they're kind of long and they're pretty emphatic. You can hear the difference between them. But as you continue to practice at it, we make them shorter, we squeeze them down, and we make them faster. And we're doing that to train the brain to process these speech sounds quickly as it can. Of course, we're training accuracy. Do and to sound very similar. You might be having a hard time on this webinar telling the difference between them. So we're training the brain to be accurate in what it's listening to as well. Of course, this exercise is adaptive, as I mentioned. As we continue to play it, those sounds are going to get more and more similar to make it harder for our brain and to rewire our brain. But hey, if we get some wrong, no problem. It'll back off and it'll make them sound more different again. Finally, the exercises are designed to generalize. We pick these sounds because these are speech sounds that you hear every day. You're talking on the phone, you're in a noisy restaurant, you're at a movie, and there's explosions going on because you're watching a superhero movie, as the case may be. We want your brain to be able to pick out these speech sounds quickly and accurately, and that's so you can hear what people are saying, you can pay attention to it, and you can remember it, even if the listening conditions are somewhat challenging. And so I will stop there with my demo, but I think that shows that concept. And in fact, across every exercise in BrainHQ, and there are about 29 different exercises. I'm not going to demo them all today, obviously, but every single exercise in BrainHQ, as you play it, I think you will be able to see, well, hey, how does this train speed? How does this train accuracy? You'll be able to notice, how is the exercise getting more difficult or getting more easy for us as I work through it? Those are fundamentally the principles of how we are rewiring brains through training in exactly this way. So, Stephanie, with my eye on the clock, I think I will pause there, we can see if there are some questions from our audience about how this all works.
Yeah, absolutely. So our first question is coming from Janet, and this is referring to, I believe, the beep when you answer questions within levels. How important is the beep, and what happens to the brain if it's turned off? If you play with it muted, for example.
Right. It's very common for people to play muted. I play BrainHQ on my phone sometimes. I'm on the subway, and of course, I have the sound off when I do that. Of course, we also have lots of people who are using BrainHQ who are hard of hearing. We have people who are using BrainHQ have no hearing whatsoever. So the rewards are designed to work together. The beep is one part of the reward, but there's always a visual reward animation as well to show that you've done right. So as long as you are hearing and seeing one of those things, that's actually enough signal to tell your brain, hey, you got this right, and to pump some dopamine and help rewire your brain to help lock that learning in. So if you have the sound off, don't worry, you probably should not be doing the auditory exercises if you have the sound off. But if you're doing the visual exercises or some of those other ones with the sound off, because that's convenient, go right ahead. Mostly we want people to be able to train wherever they find yourself. And if you're in a place where it's not appropriate to have the sound on, no worries. Go ahead and do those BrainHQ exercises and turn the sound off. So great question. Great question.
Yeah. Leland actually has a pretty interesting question here. So going back to exercises and the adjustment of the training threshold, if you need 2 successes for the stimuli to increase in difficulty and then 1 failure or 1 misclick for it to decrease in difficulty, then how does that speak to the sort of 80% accuracy rate that we're shooting for?
That is a great question, Leland. And if you're ready to enroll in graduate school in psychophysics at any time, or perhaps you already have, you're right on target. Different exercises in BrainHQ use different, what we call adaptive algorithms. In Hawkeye, you're right. It takes 2 to get up and then 1 to get down. And so that actually tracks to a little bit less than 80%. And we do that because we want people to be able to rapidly move up at the beginning. Other exercises, for example, Target Tracker, I believe, uses a different algorithm. We do that mostly because all of these algorithms track into somewhere between 65 and 80% correct, and that's generally what we want. But in some exercises, for example, in Target Tracker, each time you go up, it adds a whole object. And so that's quite a bit more difficult. We want to give people a chance to get 2 wrong before they fall back, because we don't want people to fall back as soon as they just miss 1, because it takes a long time to get up. But you're very sharp, Leland, for noticing that those different algorithms are different in exactly that way. And the scientists picked each algorithm for each exercise to try and maximize the amount of time that a person is training, at a level that's challenging, not too easy, but not overwhelming for them. Great question.
Yeah, fantastic question. All right, Bernadette has a question that I'm not sure that I understand the context of, but you are a neuroscientist, so maybe you will. Is there any research on BrainHQ's effect on white matter hyperintensities?
Sure. So it is a great question. So, white matter hyperintensity is, just to say what this is for people who haven't come across this.
Please.
If you go in for a brain imaging scan, typically called an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, you might have done this, right? You're going to lie down flat and they're going to put most of you, or at least your head, inside a big magnet for about 20 or 30 minutes. And the way that works is it can actually form an image of the structure of your brain by changing these intense magnetic fields around it. And one thing that, has become clear is that, as many of these images have been done in many people, is that, hey, as we get older, there's a risk to find what are called exactly this, white matter hyperintensity. So these are little spots in the white matter of your brain. The brain's comprised of neurons, right? That's what processes the information. A neuron has a cell body, which you might remember from high school biology, right? It's got a nucleus, and that's where the DNA is and so forth. But neurons actually have a long kind of wire that comes out of them called an axon, and that gets insulated in something that looks white. And so a white matter hyperintensity means it looks like there's little tiny bits of damage in the parts of the brain where these wires are all going through and crossing each other. And, they might be due to sort of tiny, tiny little micro strokes. Like even calling it a stroke makes it sound too scary, but like the tiniest little bit of blood has escaped, for example, from a blood vessel and damaged some brain around it. Or it might just be sort of what they call wear and tear on the brain, right? As we get older, our bodies accumulate scars, things happen to us, and, maybe our brain does a little bit as well. But one way or the other, it's pretty clear that if you have more white matter hyperintensities, you might be at a higher risk for experiencing cognitive decline or even going on to dementia and things like that. So they're not terribly good for your brain. So that's all a lot of background to basically say, hey, actually, there has not yet been a study that's looked at the effect of BrainHQ training on white matter hyperintensities as such, but there certainly have been some related studies. So there have been some very nice studies, for example, that use that same kind of magnetic imaging to look at, hey, how healthy are those wires and their insulation? And what those studies have generally been showing, there's one that's published already, and there's one that I was just looking at yesterday that hasn't come out yet, but will be coming out soon, is that BrainHQ seems to make that insulation thicker around those wires and strengthen it. And that's almost certainly a good idea as we get older. We want that insulation to stay thick and help that electricity move through our brains quickly and accurately. So we don't know specifically about white matter hyperintensities yet. The other sort of brain health markers that are around that seem like, hey, they're positively influenced by BrainHQ training. So great question.
Yeah, definitely one that I hadn't heard of before. So that's always exciting to get a new kind of question. All right, so I have sort of a two-part question from Hank. Hank is wondering how long it takes to train with BrainHQ before you start seeing results. And, if you stop training, how long do results from training with BrainHQ last for?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So, hey, brain training is different than a drug. It's more like physical exercise. And what I mean by that is if you think about a drug, think about taking an aspirin for a headache, right? You expect that to kick in quite quickly, right? Like, 15 minutes, half an hour, you want to see the effects of that aspirin. So it has a very rapid onset. And then, of course, hey, if you don't take any more aspirin, it doesn't help you anymore, right? You have another headache a week later, you're going to need to take another aspirin. Brain training is very different than that. Brain training is like exercise. If we think about exercise, let's say you start a program of swimming, right? You're not going to become a stronger, faster swimmer on the first day you swim. It's going to take a while. And it's going to take a while to see those benefits, but you will see them, right? You're going to become stronger and you're going to become healthier. You're going to have better endurance. You might lower your cholesterol. You might lower your risk of heart attack. And then, of course, if you stop swimming, let's say you do that for 6 months and you experience those benefits. If you stop swimming, hey, those benefits don't wear off right away, right? You can stop for a while and you will still be a healthier person. But you do have to come back to it eventually, right? If you got a lot of exercise in your 20s, it doesn't mean that you can stop in your 40s because you trained a lot in your 20s. So brain training is like that. The first day of you do your brain training is really just learning how the system works and starting to get used to it. What the clinical trials show us, the shortest clinical trials that I've seen involve about 10 hours of BrainHQ training, and that's typically done over the course of a month or two. And those show very clear improvements in cognitive function. And what we see when we talk to people or we do those studies is that, hey, most people are starting to notice that they are feeling sharper, that they're noticing the world around them better. They're noticing that somewhat before that 10-hour mark. But of course, some people takes longer to train the brain into such a situation that they notice it. But I would give that kind of rough estimate that most people are noticing that, after 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 hours of brain training over the course of a month or two. Now, how long does it last? Well, there have been very nice studies about this. And once a person stops brain training, again, the benefits are still there, but you can start to see them wearing off after maybe 3 months of not training, and you'll see them wear off a little bit more after 6 months of training. That being said, what the science seems to show us is, hey, if you can keep going. Absolutely. And we have a lot of BrainHQ users who train every week and they just keep going and going. And that's fantastic. But hey, if you take a break, if you've done 2 or 3 months, you take a break for a month or 2 or 3, that's fine. After 3 months, 4 months, certainly after 6, it's time to come back and jump back into it. And I think most people will notice that their sharpness is starting to wear off a little bit at that point, and it's time to come back to BrainHQ and boost that back up again. But the good news is you don't have to train every day. And if you want to take a break because it's summer and you got family in town, or you want to take a break and it's winter and it's the holiday season, that's fine. The BrainHQ brain health benefits don't wear off right away, but you should come back to it and dive back into it. Great question.
Yeah, great answer. All right, so we have a question from Doug who's asking about the science behind BrainHQ in populations with traumatic brain injury. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it's one that I've actually worked on quite specifically myself with a number of collaborators. Traumatic brain injury, for those of you who don't know, just say it out loud, is when the brain itself has suffered a physical injury. And usually doctors divide it into 2 types. There's what's called mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. And the mild here is pretty deceptive. A concussion is actually a pretty big deal. But we've heard about that a lot, of course, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had so many service members come back after having multiple concussions. And originally people thought, well, that's no big deal, right? It's mild, but it turned out to be a pretty big deal for a lot of these soldiers. And then, of course, we have moderate and severe traumatic brain injuries where, typically the skull has actually been broken and there's a more direct physical injury to the brain itself. There have been a number of studies that have looked at this. And in fact, I was specifically involved in a study funded by the Department of Defense, where we looked at the effects of BrainHQ compared to ordinary video games. And we worked with service members and veterans at a number of VA medical centers and a number of military hospitals. And we saw quite nicely that the BrainHQ training improved people's overall cognitive performance across things like memory and thinking and planning and executive function and attention. And that was quite exciting because a lot of these folks who've had a mild TBI, they might have had cognitive issues for a number of years. We showed that we could, that the BrainHQ training, improved that. Now, there's more research to be done. I'm not here to, tell you that BrainHQ is a treatment for TBI, but that science is really starting to come in and become more and more clear. And I'm quite optimistic that what we're going to see over time is that there's a lot of ways that the brain can be damaged, if I may put it that way. One way is, hey, we get older, right? And wear and tear just happens on our brain. Another way is, as you ask about, maybe you've had a TBI. But there are other ways as well, right? Maybe you've had cancer and you've had a chemotherapy and you're suffering cognitive fog and chemo brain, right? Maybe you have schizophrenia, right? You were unlucky to be born with a certain set of genes and have a certain things happen to you. And hey, your brain is wired up in such a way that it feels foggy and you have cognitive impairment. It's my belief as a scientist that, as we learn more and more about that, we're going to see there's lots of different things that can happen to brains. But hey, in the end, you have a brain kind of like that rat we looked at where, hey, it's just kind of noisy and slow. And if that's the case, then, hey, helping that brain become faster and more accurate is probably going to be good for a lot of different brains. So wonderful question. And if you have more questions about that study, just email us at support@brainhq.com. Be happy to talk about that some more. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess continuing on with the train of various conditions here, we have a couple of people asking about dementia and Alzheimer's and the studies that BrainHQ has been used in regarding those populations.
Oh, well, also just a wonderful question, And hey, an important one in my life. One of the reasons that I joined Posit Science when it was first founded, when my advisor, our chief science officer, Mike Mersnick, called me up and he told me, hey, Henry, we've helped a lot of rats get better brains. We've helped a lot of monkeys get better brains. Don't you think it's about time to help some people get better brains? That's a pretty good pitch. And Stephanie, that's why I came to work here. My grandfather passed away of Alzheimer's disease when I was about 10 years old. And that was really quite a long time ago now. And it was at a time we didn't really know very much about Alzheimer's disease, right? When he passed, we barely understood that Alzheimer's disease was something. Mostly we just thought that, hey, we get older and we get senile, as they called it. And that's just kind of what happens to brains as they get older. But, we've made a lot of progress in understanding the basic biology of Alzheimer's. And we now understand that, there are certain kinds of proteins that appear to be processed incorrectly in the brain. And you might have heard of amyloid plaques or tau tangles. And it seems like something biochemical is happening in the brain that's maybe slowly building up, probably over decades, eventually causing the damage that leads to Alzheimer's. So we are starting to there have been some initial studies using BrainHQ in what's called mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of, again, the cognitive decline that seems like it happens before you get diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, you and maybe a family member, your doctor, started to notice some significant changes in your memory or your thinking, but you can still kind of get about life in an okay way, right? You're still driving and maybe you're still working and so forth and so on. So there've been a couple studies using BrainHQ and MCI, and again, really shown quite promising results so far. That in these kinds of people who are starting to experience this kind of memory and thinking loss, that hey, BrainHQ training seems like it improves their cognitive abilities. And that's exciting, because what that might start to tell us is, hey, it's not too late, right? Starting brain training earlier is almost certainly better. But so far the news looks like that you can start brain training at a later point, and it's still going to be helpful to you. Now, again, I want to emphasize, there's definitely in this field more science that's required before any doctors or I would be telling you, hey, BrainHQ can be used to help with this. So, for example, in mild cognitive impairment, we've seen these nice improvements in cognitive function, but we definitely have no idea. Hey, does that mean you're not going to get Alzheimer's one way or the other, right? These are still questions that are in front of us. But there's every reason to think that, making a healthier brain at an early stage is a good idea. So there's more science that needs to be done here. And the NIH actually is really been a fantastic partner. Happy to say that the NIH has made the National Institutes of Aging in particular has made two of the largest grant fundings that it's ever done, specifically to look at clinical trials to use BrainHQ in mild cognitive impairment to see if it could stop the onset of Alzheimer's. And in a related study to use BrainHQ to see if, hey, even in healthy people, can we prevent the onset of Alzheimer's and other dementias. So we're really excited about that. That's been very, very fantastic to see. That being said, we all look forward to the day where there's as much money being spent on brain training and other brain health initiatives as there are on drug research, right? Drug companies will spend $1 billion in this field. And Stephanie, we've spent our fair share of money on research here, but we definitely have not spent $1 billion on brain training research yet. And I'd certainly like to see a world where, more groups are following the NIH's lead and really investing in this very promising field, whether it's in TBI or Alzheimer's or other conditions, to say, hey, can this really start to work as a medical treatment in this way? And that would be very exciting if that happens.
Yeah, if somebody in the audience has $1 billion that they want us to spend on research for this, please let us know.
Very popular to spend $1 billion buying a social media network, but if you'd like to spend $1 billion to cure Alzheimer's, we're here to try and help you with that goal. So absolutely,
sign me up. All right, so we have a couple of follow-up questions regarding the threshold, the sort of like 80% accuracy that we were talking about earlier.
Sure.
What happens when I'm training if I don't get 4 out of 5 answers right? Does it mean that there's no improvement going on at all? And Meredith is also asking, does that mean that you can't ever technically score higher than like a C on an exercise? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Those are great questions. So, as we were talking about a moment ago, these exercises track your performance to maybe between 60 or 65 and 80% correct. But you might exactly ask that. Hey, if you're supposed to get 4 out of 5, what if I go on a losing streak, right? What if I get 4 wrong in a row? And trust me, that's happened to me. It's happened to everyone in positive science. You'll get to a certain level and then just, hey, your focus snaps a little bit, or you're just out a little bit ahead of yourself and it's going to track right back down. That is okay. And, what's important for rewiring the brain is doing this training over the course of, several minutes as you sit down to BrainHQ. It's going to get harder. And that's fine. It's going to get easier and back off, and that's fine. I think it matters less what happens on any individual turn in a BrainHQ exercise, and it matters a whole lot more, hey, what's just generally the pattern of how you're doing over the course of 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of training. And that's why the exercises are adaptive. There should be just about nobody who sits down at a BrainHQ exercise and just gets, 80% of them wrong every time. If that happens to you, give us a call, but it really doesn't, because again, the exercises will adapt and get easier. So if you get one wrong, don't worry. If you get 5 wrong in a row, just look at yourself and say, well, Dr. Henry Monka, CEO of Positive Science, has gotten 5 in a row wrong. So you could feel like we're all in the same boat. It's going to back off, and then you're going to get back on again. And that's fine, because what's happening on the brain, right? Let's just put it this way. All of us have moment-to-moment fluctuations in our attention and our focus, right? No matter how hard we're focusing, our focus gets a little better and a little bit worse. Very easy to be in a situation in BrainHQ where you've had a part of really sharp focus, right? Your brain's really on, you've gotten a whole bunch right in a row, and then that focus just snaps a little in the brain, right? The brain wears out of acetylcholine, it moves into a different kind of connectivity state, and you're going to get a bunch wrong. And that's okay. When you get a bunch wrong and then get one right again, hey, you're starting to push the brain forward again. So it's absolutely fine to get a whole bunch wrong in a row and just have that reset. And in fact, if you've gotten to a level at BrainHQ where you're like, this is actually just too hard for me, do what I do, get a few wrong on purpose, let it back itself off until you can get back on again. So again, what matters is over the period of, minutes, 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and not any one specific trial. I think there was a second question you mentioned in there too.
So scoring with the threshold being, somewhere between like a 65 and an 80, it sounds like we're getting C's on all of our exercises.
My 2 kids have finished school now. My son's finished college and my daughter has just finished high school. And I can say with confidence that I think most of the grading that they received, was not helpful for their learning abilities. BrainHQ percents are not like grades. So, in this case, like I said, if you're getting 80% correct or 65% correct, don't translate that into a C or a B or D. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever. For that matter, sometimes, as you know, Stephanie, people ask us about percentile scores. Hey, if I get a 60th percentile, that feels like a D. It's not a D, man. If you get 60th percentile, you're better than more than half the people on the planet who've done BrainHQ. You should feel good about yourself. So they're just not like grades, and thinking about them grades, it just isn't terribly helpful in that way. You might think about it more like, I don't know, maybe you've ever learned a musical instrument or gone to the gym, right? So, I like to go to the gym. When you go to the gym, you lift weights. And if the only way you lift weights is that you always succeed at every single lift, you're not actually going to get that much stronger. You actually need to lift things that are too heavy to the point where you're like, okay, I couldn't quite lift that. And that's not a failure, right? That is your body saying, well, I guess I'm going to need to be stronger to do this lift. BrainHQ is exactly the same way. When you hit something that you don't get right, I don't want people to think, oh, I got that wrong or I failed. I want them to think, hey, my brain has just gotten a signal that it needs to get sharper and faster to do this. So message received, brain. Let's keep working on that.
Yeah, awesome. That is definitely a thing that comes up a lot. People mistaking, like Henry said, scoring in the 60th percentile doesn't mean that you're getting like a D on, attention exercises. It means that you're doing better than half the people that have been training with BrainHQ. So we actually have a whole other webinar on progress, and we have a whole section in our self-help center dedicated to progress. So I would recommend checking those out. And if you have any other follow-up questions about progress or how we calculate stars, shoot us an email. We're more than happy to help. I will get into the weeds with anybody on those any day. All right, so we have a question asking for some evidence that the skills in BrainHQ are transferred to daily life. We talked about that sort of generalization. What sort of evidence do we have showing that, training with BrainHQ can help ward off cognitive decline?
Oh, well, there's quite a bit of this.
There's a lot of it.
And Stephanie, maybe in the chat that everyone can see, you can put in a link to that overall page that talks about rewiring the brain and sharpening cognitive function and improving everyday life, because that has links to tons of the evidence. I'll just mention 2 things here real briefly. So a study I was involved with that we did with the Mayo Clinic and with USC We enrolled almost 500 people, and half of them did BrainHQ, and half of them did what you might think of as adult education, right? They watched educational DVDs and took quizzes on them. And, both groups are working on their brains, but, only the BrainHQ group is working on their brain to make it faster and more accurate. The education group is sort of learning facts. And before and after, we measured their cognitive function, but we also gave them questionnaires that said, hey, how do you rate your own cognitive function in real world situations? And what we found in that study quite clearly is that, hey, the BrainHQ group improved their directly measured cognitive function by about 4 times as much as the group doing adult education. But also what happened is that on those questionnaires where people were asked things like, hey, can you remember the name of someone that you meet, like at a party? If you're out at a noisy restaurant, can you hear what your friends are saying? That, hey, people's own rating of their cognitive performance got better in the BrainHQ group by quite a bit more than it did in the adult education group. So that's a real world, hey, people notice it in their own lives benefit. The second example I'll give is driving, just because there's been a lot of work done on driving safety with BrainHQ. And you might remember that Hawkeye exercise we were just talking about, making your peripheral vision more fast and more accurate so you could notice something. Well, it turns out that people who do BrainHQ exercises related to that skill, they actually end up safer on the road. A study that followed drivers for about 6 years after they had done about 10 to 18 hours of BrainHQ training showed that they reduced the risk of having an at-fault crash on the road by about 48%, which meant that they were noticing things out of the corner of their eye more quickly. And then as a result, stepping on the brake or making a lane change or whatever had to be done to keep themselves safe. So, just again, another really strong piece of evidence that doing these kinds of exercises, you don't just get it better at the exercise itself, but people really do see these benefits in real world situations.
All right,
Super.
fantastic.
Great question.
So we had a couple of people write into us about for the visual exercises, where do you focus your eyes, or sort of what are some coaching suggestions? Like, should you have sort of a soft gaze at the screen, or should you be focusing in a particular spot? Can you speak to that a little bit? I think it's going to vary from exercise to exercise, but what do you think?
It is. But so let's start with an easy one. There's the visual sweeps exercise. And if you've done this exercise, what you see is you see a little pattern of lines, and they either kind of look like they're expanding or they look like they're contracting. And you have to say, well, did I see them expand or contract? That exercise is designed to train visual speed in the center of your gaze. So I would say, when I do that, I adopt a very firm, focused gaze right at the center of my screen. I want all my attention there. I want all my brain speed there to do that exercise because it gets very fast. But other exercises are different. So for example, when I'm doing the Hawkeye exercise that we just discussed, I'll adopt what I think the questioner might mean as a softer gaze, right? I'm still looking at the center of the screen because the bird could kind of appear anywhere, but I'm softening my gaze. And what I mean by that, and what I think the questioner means by that is I'm really trying to expand the realm that I'm paying attention to, because, hey, that bird could appear anywhere on the clock and I need to have enough attention to really notice that. And I think a lot of BrainHQ exercises work like that. For example, if you're doing target tracker, where you're seeing, a couple of different bubbles moving around, right? You got to track them all, so you can't just stare at one of them. I usually try and make a little shape out of them. Like if there's 4, I feel like there's a little square, and I try to feel like how the square is moving around. But again, you have to sort of feel like you're broadening your visual field to do that. And that's in fact exactly what you want to do on those exercises. They are designed to train your speed and your attention as far and broad as we can make it, because of course we want that fast, accurate visual system across everything that you see. So, great question.
Yeah, and if you are watching this and you have a question about training tips for specific exercises, once again, let us know. We've all been training with BrainHQ for years now. We're happy to share our silly tips and tricks with you anytime. All right, so
here's one that I'd like to take, Stephanie, now that I see
go for it.
It's from Georgia saying, hey, I find the visual bar distracting and it causes me to lose my focus. Have you considered other rewards? And Georgia, I think what you're talking about is, at the top of the screen, as we saw in Hawkeye, there's kind of a green arrows that fill in as you get them right and the bubbles move up. And, they're designed to give feedback because we want people to get a sense of, hey, this is getting harder, this is getting easier. But hey, some users have told us they're distracting. And, when I myself am doing the BrainHQ exercises, I actually am trying to focus my attention, a little bit, as we were just talking about, on the screen itself, whether it's the moving balls or the butterflies, an eye for detail or what have you. And then what I do is, hey, when the exercise is done, when I've given my response, sometimes I'll look up and I'll just check, how we're doing up there. How many stars have I earned? How many turns do I have left? But I do actually try to ignore it while I'm actually doing the exercises itself. So don't feel like you have to pay attention to those green arrows filling in or that bubble moving or so forth. Pay attention to what's showing in front of you and use that to kind of check on now and then after you've done a turn. So great question.
Yeah, kind of unintentionally an attention exercise built into every exercise.
I suppose.
All right, so going back to the science and studies behind BrainHQ, Tess is asking, has there been any study of a potential placebo effect when training with BrainHQ?
Oh, sure. Every study we run actually considers placebo effects. So I was talking for a moment ago about that study we did with the Mayo Clinic and with USC. Half the people got BrainHQ exercises, half of them people got adult education. And that lets us compare the two. And in fact, that adult education group is designed to control for the placebo effect, right? Those folks are doing something useful with their brains, right? They're studying, the history of art or science of the universe or what have you. So if there's going to be a placebo effect, we're going to see it in that group. And the fact that the improvement in cognitive function was 4 times bigger in the BrainHQ group than the adult education group shows that, hey, the BrainHQ results are not just placebo results, right? That they're, bigger and stronger than just a placebo effect or an expectation effect. So we do that in every single study that we run. We're always comparing BrainHQ to something, and that something is always chosen because, hey, it could drive a placebo effect. So we've compared BrainHQ to crossword puzzles, to adult education. We've compared BrainHQ to video games, just all kinds of stuff like that. And in study after study, BrainHQ does better, which tells us that, hey, this isn't a placebo effect. This is a very real change that's happening in rewiring the brain.
Yeah, that actually goes and answers Heather's question nicely. Why are BrainHQ exercises better than crossword puzzles and Sudoku?
Yeah, but also actually that's a great question for this webinar in particular. So thank you, Heather. We talked about how do we rewire brains. We talked about those 5 principles, right? Speed, accuracy, adaptivity, generalization, and engagement. So how do crossword puzzles stack up against that? Well, not so much for speed, right? You can kind of sit there and think about it for as long as you like, right? You don't have to, your brain does not have to work fast at all. Accuracy, obviously you have to get the answer right, but you're not training like your ability to see or to hear accurately the way you are. Adaptivity, well, they don't really change as you do them, right? I mean, the New York Times gets harder each day, but you just sort of have to stop at some point because it gets too hard. New York Times doesn't send you an easier one because today's is too hard. So for these kinds of reasons, I don't think we really don't think of crossword puzzles as a great brain training activity. They don't really have the properties that we see are required to rewire the brain. Now, I don't mean to come across negative about crossword puzzles. If you enjoy them, you should do them. I like playing the Wordle. I play the Wordle each day. I don't think it's rewiring my brain in any terribly helpful way. There's certainly no evidence that it is. And in fact, the science of crossword puzzles, there was quite a nice study done out of UVA quite a while ago. And what they looked at was, across people of all kinds of different ages, they compared people who did a lot of crossword puzzles to people who didn't do any crossword puzzles. And what they found was pretty interesting, which is that, hey, at any age, the people who did crossword puzzles had better cognitive function, which sounds promising. But what they then saw was that if you looked at the change across ages, the rate of decline in cognitive function was exactly the same for the crossword puzzling group and the non-crossword puzzling group. So that tells you that crossword puzzles don't seem to change the rate of cognitive decline as we age. It just means that, hey, man, people who are better at crossword puzzles are also probably better at cognitive tests, but the crossword puzzles don't make them any better at cognitive tests and cognitive function. So if you do them, like them, but they're not a substitute for a real brain health activity by any stretch of the imagination. Great question.
All right. Yeah, fantastic. All right, so unfortunately, I think that was going to be our last question for the webinar today. We have so many questions that went unanswered, so I would implore you all, please email us support@brainhq.com. You can also check out our support site, support.brainhq.com. I put those links in the chat, so you can go ahead and copy those down. I'll also go ahead and throw them up on screen for everybody. There we go. And yeah, I just want to take another second here to thank you, Henry, for giving that presentation and answering all of those questions and taking that time. And to our audience today, thank you all so much for participating and asking all of those amazing questions. We have a webinar coming up next month. It's going to be called The Brain as a Time Machine, and that is going to be run by our very own Dr. Michael Merzenich. So that is going to be happening on August 16th. We'll send out invites for that 1 week beforehand, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Henry, do you have any last words that you want to share with our audience today?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming. You know, Stephanie, whenever we do these webinars specifically on the science of the exercise, you know, I love the science of the exercise. I helped build these exercises, but I'm always like, well, is anyone really going to come and ask a question about this? So just fantastic to have everyone come and ask such a great set of questions. I'm glad we got to the ones we did, like Stephanie did. If we didn't get to your question and you'd love to have us answer it, just send it to support@BrainHQ and we will take a swing at it. But thanks to everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day and happy brain training.
Happy brain training.